These two women sentenced to 12 years of what they call reform through labor. What kind of labor would they be forced to do?
Well, it's very unclear whether or not the women are ever going to end up in a camp like Yodok, the one that you referred to. They seem, I think, much more likely to become pawns in a North Korean effort to try and extract some diplomatic concessions from the United States. Certainly their treatment so far has been, by North Korean standards, pretty good. The impression is that they've been held in a guest house in Pyongyang. They've been allowed to receive a visit a couple of times from the Swedish ambassador to North Korea, who represents American interests there. They've been allowed both to write and to telephone their families. So I don't think they have been mistreated so far, and I think that is an encouraging signal that the North may be open to some kind of diplomatic resolution.
And when you had said before that you'd seen relatively encouraging signs throughout the ordeal, those are the signs that give you hope?
Yeah, I think a couple of other ones as well. The North Koreans could have charged them with espionage, which is both a more serious offense and one where the North would have put itself in a position to demand a formal apology from the U.S. government. That was not the case. They were charged with lesser offenses, although the sentence is still very severe. But I think you have to understand that the internal politics in North Korea, there clearly are more hardline elements pushing for a much tougher line towards the U.S., towards South Korea. So it may be that this long sentence is a sop to those forces, and now having imposed the sentence, the possibility might exist for some kind of dialogue if the two sides can figure out the terms under which they talk to each other on this case.
Do we know much about the justice system? I don't even know if that's the correct term in North Korea. I mean, there's not an appeals process like there was even in Iran for the journalist in Iran who was charged.
No, the North Korean system is an absolute totalitarian system. The state decides. This court is considered to be, that sentenced them, is the highest, so there is no appeal possible. But I don't think that, I think this has to be seen as essentially a political act more than a criminal one. And the ultimate fate of these two women is going to depend on political and diplomatic factors. I would be very surprised if these women do not remain in some kind of confinement in a guest house. I would be shocked if they were sent to one of these prison camps at this stage of the game. I think the question now really is what kind of terms, if any, are possible for the U.S. and North Korea to engage to try and work this issue out.
A lot of moving parts to this story, any one of which could derail the effort to free Lori and Yuna. Let's dig deeper now with Mike Chinoy, and we're also joined by senior political analyst David Gergen and Christine Ahn of the Korea Policy Institute. David, you feel that the U.S., basically separate from these two journalists, is heading to some sort of confrontation with North Korea?
We're heading toward a possible showdown now. It's been very interesting. This administration came in ready to talk. They said they'd go to Pyongyang. Hillary Clinton might go there. They appointed Steve Bosworth, this very distinguished former diplomat, as a special envoy to North Korea. They can't break the code. They can't get in, and they've been rebuffed by the North Koreans. But more than that, the North Koreans have suddenly set off on this very mischievous, dangerous path, blowing up a nuclear weapon and doing missiles. And the administration, strikingly now, has been sending off signals in the last few days. It's not going to play the game that the Clinton administration and the Bush administration played. I was there in the Clinton administration when we decided to essentially buy them off. If you'll stop the nuclear program, we'll give you oil, we'll give you a nuclear power plant, we'll give you food. We tried that. It didn't work. It failed. The Bush administration came along and said, we don't want to do that. And then they eventually did. It failed again. This administration is saying, we're not going to bargain with these people anymore. We're going to get tough. We're going to crack down on this. We're not going to allow them. The administration has decided, apparently, that North Korea is intent on getting nuclear capacity, and they're going to try to stop it. And Anderson, it could lead to a confrontation, and it's going to be a very important signal to the Iranians about how the U.S. will handle a nuclear capacity in a dangerous country.
Christine, for the family of these two journalists, though, that is probably the worst possible news that they could hear, that there's a confrontation coming, that these two, I know for a fact the family is concerned that they're caught up in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. And I think that what most Americans don't realize is that the United States and North Korea are still in a state of war. And when I was in North Korea last summer, I was coming out, and you go through China, and then you get to Incheon in Seoul. And when I got into the airports, all around the monitors were breaking news about the South Korean women that had wandered into sort of a protected zone. And despite repeated appeals to have her return back to South Korean territory. And mind you, this is in Mount Gumgang, which is a tourist site that was created jointly between the South and North Koreans, that, she was shot and she was killed. And I think it's really important for Americans to realize the kind of heightened state of alert that North Korea is under, and it's unfortunate that the journalists happen to be also on the border of North Korea and China at the time that just the Key Resolve military exercises had just wrapped up between South Korea and the United States, where 26,000 U.S. and South Korean and other troops essentially simulate an attack and invasion on North Korea.
Mike, would it make sense for the U.S. to send an envoy over there? I mean, there have been some talk about Bill Richardson. He's gone over in the past, negotiated some releases.
Well, you have this very dangerous dynamic of confrontation that's been building. It's partly because I think the North Koreans by the end of the Bush administration came to the conclusion they really weren't getting what they bargained for in their dealings with the United States. And then you do have a succession process with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-il, who had a stroke last August, who's trying to lay the groundwork for his youngest son to succeed him. And all of this, I think, has combined to make the North Koreans very, very tough. And as David pointed out, the Obama administration doesn't want to play the same games again. But this case, if it can be defined as a humanitarian issue separate from the bigger issues, there might be a possibility of sending someone. The fact that the parent company that these women work for is run by Al Gore, who's a very senior figure who could get on the phone to Barack Obama if he needed to, might be appealing to the North Koreans. And I would assume that there have been some back-channel discussions about whether somebody would go and how and what kind of what they would have to say or do to try and win their release. These women are not useful to North Korea rotting in a gulag. They're useful as pawns to extract something from Washington.
Christine, do we know how decisions are made in North Korea? I mean, who would it ultimately be? Kim Jong-il, who would be deciding the fate of Laura and Yuna?
I think that Mike Chinoy brought up a really great point. I don't know if it was Mike or somebody else on the show earlier, but North Korea is not a monolith state. I mean, there are hardliners and there are more people that are more sort of toting a more liberal, engagement line. And so I'm not sure how the process is being decided, but I agree with Mike that they are definitely, North Korea will leverage, the situation as best as they can. And I think that the other point that's really important to recognize in all of this is that the U.S. and North Korea is at war, and there are still 10 million families that are being divided. And so as a Korean American that was really kind of hoping the Obama administration would come in, and despite the rhetoric, it's actually quite different from the reality. I think that, a lot of analysts will say, yes, that Clinton said before she went to Asia that she would consider a peace treaty, she would consider normalized relations. But the actual process of demanding that North Korea completely, verifiably, disclose their nuclear weapons plan is the same old. And so what James Laney has pointed out, who is the former ambassador to South Korea under the Clinton administration, he's made a very, very cogent point, which is without a peace treaty, without some kind of mutualist trust between the two countries, we'll never get beyond. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we need to end the Korean War, we need to demilitarize Korea, we need to have a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and we need to free these two women. And the only way to do that is through direct negotiation and talks.
Is it in the interest of the U.S. government to separate the issue of Laura and Yuna from all the rest?
Absolutely. I think Mike is right. Just sending a special envoy, treating it as a humanitarian mission, trying to do it quickly, Anderson. So the longer they stay there, the more they're going to get caught up in this bigger, complicated picture. I think there's a very, very strong interest in getting Al Gore or Bill Richardson or Steve Bosworth to go over there pretty darn quickly and see if you can't separate them out. But what is so striking again here, Anderson, is when President Obama came back from the Middle East, we all thought his agenda was going to be consumed by the greater Middle Middle East. Suddenly, North Korea.
Yeah, that was last week. This is this week. Yeah,
exactly.
Who knows what's next week? David Gergen, Christine Ahn, thank you very much. Mike Chinoy, great to have you on the program as well, Mike. Thanks.